Good afternoon, good morning, whatever time it might be where you are. It's the late afternoon here where I am today. Andrew Cohn, welcoming you back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. And this month we are talking about Adam Grant's excellent book, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. Adam is a decorated faculty member at the Wharton School here in Philadelphia, a good guy, an interesting bird, an original, as is the title of one of his very well-regarded books, and certainly somebody that is a delightful actor on the thought player stage in academia. And I also appreciate the way he keeps it real. He's definitely a research-oriented guy, but he's also, I think, practical and thinks big picture. And we'll see if you agree with that after you hear a little bit about this book. Again, this is the cover of the book. I like the idea of the match lighting with water instead of flame as a notion of what's possible and can we expand our thinking, which is what this book is largely about. So let's jump into it. Before I say that, I would certainly, as always, invite you to contact me with any questions or comments, particularly around disagreement you have with this book or how I'm talking about it, and also how you might use it. Because I'm a leadership development consultant and coach, I tend to interpret these books, and will here interpret it through a lens of how can we improve, how can we use this book to lead ourselves, our teams, in our communities, our families better, because that's how I tend to apply this content, because that's what's important to me and where my meaning and purpose is. And I look forward to welcoming in a conversation with you about that. So let me share screen. I prepared some slides that should help the conversation stay on track a bit. So let's do that. And I'm also going to, there we go. So again, this is our book. I've learned to include photographs of book covers because sometimes there's different versions of books and people say, did you mean this book or that book? And so this just makes it a little bit more clear. The book is divided into three sections or three parts. Part one is individual rethinking. How can we update our own views? Part two is interpersonal rethinking. How can we help to, not that it's up to us or that we have the ability, but what could we do to help to open up other people's minds? And part three is collective rethinking, creating communities of lifelong learners. Those are the three parts to the book. And just generally, this is a book that's largely about the importance of rethinking, of questioning our own thinking, of considering the limitations of just what we believe. That's how I would introduce it. It's not a dense read. It is not a thick read. It's a pretty quick read. It's full of useful stories, often entertaining. He doesn't take himself too seriously, which is actually one element of collective rethinking that we'll come back to later in this talk. Definitely worth looking at, I think, for sure. I definitely recommend it. So those are the three sections of the book. And then there's some recommendations he puts in at the end. The way I'm structuring this overview is to blend those two together. So the recommendations are going to come into the three parts to the book that we'll talk about. It's just more logical to do it that way. But again, real practical, would definitely recommend it. Let's get into part one, individual rethinking. So I have a couple of themes to share from this section. One of them is just the starting point of why should we question our thinking? What's wrong with our conclusions? We've gotten to fairly successful places. Why do we need to question our thinking? And so Professor Grant talks about the CEO of BlackBerry who fought to, no, there's nothing's going to happen with this iPhone. Everybody's going to stay on our platform, and lost market share at just a devastating rate. People who chose to invest in the Ponzi scheme with Bernie Madoff here in the United States, and perhaps globally too, but he was a New York guy, is a New York guy, I think he's still alive, but took a lot of people's money because we thought we a point of view, we had an opinion, and he shares a story in there about someone who stuck to that opinion about, no, I just think this is a good investment. Are we willing to rethink what we believe about an idea or a possibility or an investment for that matter? Those would be two of the examples that he talked about that makes us think, well, maybe I should question my own thinking. And there's also some juicy quotations in this book, as well as illustrations that I've copied and included in this presentation. And you'll see they're a little bit, the lighting isn't great. I'm not a studio guy, but it makes the point. One of the quotes is that the accelerating pace of change means that we need to question our beliefs more readily than ever before. Makes sense, right? If change is moving faster, then there's more of a reason for us to rethink what we think we know. So let me bring in this quotation here about the pace of change from the book. In 2011, you consumed about 5 times as much information per day as you would have just a quarter century earlier, right? So we're consuming 5 times as much information per day in 2011 than 25 years earlier. And that, by the way, was 11 years ago. As of 1950, it took about 50 years for knowledge in medicine to double. By 1980, medical knowledge was doubling every 7 years. By 2010, it was doubling in half that time, in about 3.5 years. Information and knowledge is accelerating and putting more pressure on us, I would argue, and he argues, to update our thinking. And he says, we update things all the time. We update our wardrobes, we update our cars, we update a number of things. We tend to not update our thinking very much. Part of the reason for that, he says, is that we tend to operate like preachers, prosecutors, or politicians rather than scientists. So the scientist is one who's going to develop a hypothesis and test it. In fact, affirmatively look for flaws, look for contradicting information, look for people who might disagree, hold it up in front of other people. What do you think of this diagnosis? A preacher, meanwhile, is going to look for ways to convince people of his or her point of view. A prosecutor is going to try to win and argue down the other side. I have some experience with that in my background. I'm grateful to be out of that church or that operation. And politicians will be taking action to be popular. And that's the way he uses the term. And they may frame an argument in a way to get approval. But a scientist is going to look at it more neutrally and be very willing to change her mind. So one of his important theses in this book is an urge and an invitation to think like a scientist, Third point that I want to make about individual rethinking is to note that being smart can be a liability. Being smart can be a liability because often it means that we're identifying, since our identity can come from being smart, we will identify with our ideas, and we will, our ideas are us, our opinions are us. And that can remain true over time in the way I see myself. So he included this visual, which I thought was really interesting. And the invitation is, how do we see our past selves as compared to our present selves? Do we see them as separate, or do we see them as one? So, for example, all the way on the right side, the past me and the present me are the same. They're the same. So I'm the same person I was some years ago, with the same opinions. And if you look all the way on the left side, you'll see there's some distance and no overlap between past me and present me. I'm a different person than I was. Now, I may have had the same values. I may have, to some extent, have the same motivators, but in terms of what I thought, what I believed to be true, what I believed about other people or other groups or other ideologies, what I believed about what's possible is very different than what I believe now. If past me and present me are the same, it's going to be very difficult for me to detach from some ideas that I had in the past. If past me and present me are different, and I don't equate the two of those things, and I can recognize In fact, even invite a rethinking to say, God, I remember I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. That's a good thing in terms of the nature of our identity and our willingness to rethink. So the invitation here is to not be attached to who we were in the past, or we might be in the past. The invitation here is to define your identity in terms of your values, not your opinions. Your opinions can change over time. Your values are more likely to stick and be consistent. And again, the smarter we are, and I'll come back to this in a second, the smarter we are, the more we tend to hold on to some of these beliefs and over-identify with them. So the caveat here is to be aware of over-identifying with our own point of view. And of course, we could argue for and fight for what we believe is true, but it's not us. It's not us. Because if I believe that my opinion is who I am, then damn, I'm going to argue to the death for that. I'm going to be dead right, if you will. And that's really the epitome of a fixed mindset, an unwillingness to change my mind despite what I might learn, what might be presented to me, the feedback I might get from people close to me, partners, spouses, friends, kids, colleagues, bosses, customers. Can I read the writing on the wall? Because if I'm going to define myself by my opinions, it's going to be very difficult for me to change my mind. That's the learner mindset invitation as opposed to the fixed mindset, So that's one key piece of this book. In my point of view, from an executive coaching point of view and leadership development point of view, this is huge because this can be very difficult for us, and my hand is up here, to let go of a strong opinion and recognize that it's more important for me to hold to my values than to that opinion. And I am not what I believe. Or as a teacher of mine used to say, don't believe everything you think. I think that's wise. Be aware of the overconfidence cycle. I think this is really quite interesting. So he advocates for and argues for what's on the left here, the rethinking cycle. So if we approach situations with some level of humility, we get some information, it might cause us to doubt something. Then we might be curious, well, wait a minute, so what is true? What else might be true? Or what else might I believe given this new information? Because I'm doubting my previous point of view, my previous position. And with that curiosity can come discovery. And therefore, I'm rethinking my point of view. I'm informed, and I'm rethinking my point of view. The overconfidence cycle, which does tend to happen to all of us at some point in time, is if we're operating from a sense of pride as opposed to humility, pride or attachment or fixed mindset, then we are convicted, right? We are convicted. We demonstrate conviction. We operate with conviction. We think with conviction. And therefore, the confirmation bias comes in where we're going to be looking for things that confirm our point of view. And we're going to interpret information through a desirability bias, right? Because I have strong conviction about this opinion. And therefore, all I'm going to get to is validation of what I already know. It'd be very, very difficult to change my mind. So that's the overconfidence cycle. So one great opportunity here is to approach different ideas with humility. And we'll come back to this notion of, he has a phrase called confident humility, which we'll come back to momentarily. But I love this illustration. This is something else that I copied out of the book. And I think, obviously, we're all trying to get to more of the left side than the right, understanding that there will be times where we attach to our opinions, we hang on with very strong conviction to things that maybe we should let go. But this book discusses this notion of the overconfidence cycle. I think it's a great visual and a good distinction. Point 5, seek out information that goes against your views. Actively seek out information. And he talks about how in writing the book, he would send the chapter to some of his challenge team who would get back to him with some really brutal critical feedback. Didn't agree with all of it, but he agreed with a lot of it, he talks about, and he modified these chapters, and it's stronger as a result. It's pressure tested, if you will. Seek out information that goes against your views. As he says, actively engage with ideas that challenge your assumptions. Follow people who make you think, even if you usually disagree with what they think. And it requires some affirmative motion here to follow people like this. What are the podcasts that we're listening to? What are the news feeds, or at least the email threads that we might see that will challenge our views? If it causes us to change our mind, great, we learned something. And if it reinforces our views, then we can feel even better about what we believe. So seek out information that goes against your views, and don't confuse confidence with competence. So he cites something in research called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which has proven that the better you think you are at something, the more competent you think you are at something, the greater the risk that you're overestimating yourself. So when we don't think we know very much, we're more likely to be humble and open-minded. If we think we're really good at something, we're likely to lock into our point of view and not welcome or accept information that challenges our competence. And that there's some references in the book that talk about corporate leadership and feedback and a number of other contexts where that's true. So beware what he calls the Dunning-Kruger effect. The better we are at something, the greater the risk that we're overestimating ourselves. So something to be careful about. Okay, I mentioned this earlier. Find and operate in the sweet spot of confidence. So this is a 2x2 here, as you can see. On the left side is belief in yourself. Am I secure or insecure about my beliefs? About myself. Do I believe in myself? So if I'm and then on the top is belief in my tools or belief in my opinions, right? So belief in myself versus belief in my tools or my opinions. So if I'm secure in myself and certain about my opinions, that's the bottom left quadrant. That's blind arrogance. I'm not going to change my mind because I have very secure belief in myself and I'm certain about this idea. It's blind arrogance. If I'm if I'm certain about my beliefs, but insecure about myself, so I have a really strong belief, but I'm not really sure about myself, then he calls that obsessive inferiority. So my own foundation is a little rocky, but I'm sticking to these ideas pretty firmly. If I'm insecure about myself and uncertain about my tools, that can be debilitating doubt. So in other words, I don't feel good about what I believe, and I don't feel good about myself. That's debilitating doubt. But the opportunity here is in the bottom left corner for what he calls confident humility, where I feel secure in myself, but I'm willing to be uncertain about my tools and about what I believe. So I'm confident I can move forward. I'm confident in part because I can relearn something. That makes me confident, as opposed to I'm confident that what I believe is correct, or what I believe is accurate, or what I believe is right, which is can be a dangerous word in this space. So confident humility is the opportunity where we can be secure about ourselves, but we can allow some uncertainty in terms of what we believe. I think this is a really interesting tool, good conversation starter as well. The sweet spot of confident humility. Okay, point 8 about individual rethinking, and that has to do with promoting constructive conflict. Constructive conflict meaning task conflict as opposed to personal conflict. So he cites this research. Forgive the crudeness of these visuals, but I think they make the point. And the research supporting the difference between low performing and high performing groups, namely the quantity of relationship conflict, the level of relationship conflict, and the level of task conflict. So if we look at low performing groups first, we see that there's more relationship conflict than task conflict. There's a reluctance to have task conflict at the beginning. Over time, there can be more task conflict, but ultimately there will be more relationship conflict than task conflict. We will be disagreeing with each other more than we'll be disagreeing with each other's ideas. If you look at high performing teams on the right side, there'll be a lot more task conflict. A lot more task conflict, less personal disagreements. The amount of task conflict will come down over time, then go back up. This is according to the research. But task conflict is good. Task conflict gets us to better ideas. gets us to better solutions, gets us to safer products. He cites NASA and a number of other examples of where task conflict is really useful. Disagreement about ideas is really useful. And relationship conflict can help teams deteriorate. He talks a bit about psychological safety and coupled with accountability. That's later in the book in part 3. This is an interesting drawing that really sums up the notion of high performance being tied to low relationship conflict, but high task conflict. Conflict is good if it's task conflict. So there's an opportunity here to promote constructive task conflict. So those are the key points, I believe, from the first part of the book related to individual rethinking. Let's transition here to interpersonal rethinking, or what he calls I'm opening other people's minds. I'm always hesitant to say that with any level of conviction because that's a difficult thing to do. But let's talk about what Professor Grant says about that. Interpersonal rethinking. Point 1, practice the art of persuasive listening. Listening is, as he argues, one of the most important things we can do to help change other people's minds is to understand the foundation of their point of view, understand what they value. So as he says, how can you show an interest in helping people crystallize their own views, help them understand what they believe and kind of why they believe it, and then uncover their own reasons for change or what might possibly be an opening to change. But how can we even know it's a little bit like inquire before we advocate in the inquiry advocacy model. Listen more to understand what's most important to people, and that can open a door to influencing them. And as he says, increase your question to statement ratio. Point 2, question how rather than why. So rather than enter into disagreements with why do you believe that way, ask them to explain how they would make their views a reality, how they would operationalize those views, what they'd like to see happen, how it could possibly happen. He says, when people describe why they hold extreme views in particular, they often intensify their commitments. They kind of double down on the why. But when they try to explain how they would make their views a reality, they might realize and can realize the limits of their understanding. Rather than talk about, it's a little bit like he says, if I want to test my own, pressure test my own beliefs, how well do I really understand something? How strong is this belief? And what's underneath that belief? Try to teach it. And this is a little bit similar. Ask someone to explain the how of how they would operationalize or effectuate that idea. It often opens up some windows of doubt, as well as windows of understanding that other person. And point 3, he says, ask other people how they originally formed an opinion. And he gives the example, especially with something like stereotypes or belief about certain types of people or roles, etc., that these things often come from some place that's really not grounded in our own experience. We just hear something and we perpetuate it. He says, prompt them to consider how they would believe different things if they'd been born at a different time or in a different place. Well, what would you think if you were born in China 100 years ago? Or what if you grew up in a totalitarian state? Or what if you didn't have a benefit of a certain type of education? Or what if you'd spent your whole life working in this type of environment? Would you think differently, or might you think differently? And he points this out as a useful tool for helping other people potentially change their views. I also think it's helpful for ourselves as well. So continuing on the theme of interpersonal rethinking is the 4th point I would make, and these loosely correspond to his points, but they're a bit different. So if you pick up the book, you'll find it's not line by line by any sense. Acknowledge common ground in conflict. Sometimes we think that if we admit that we agree with somebody on something, it's going to hurt us. He said, no, the research shows that admitting points of convergence shows we're willing to negotiate about what's true. We're open-minded. The other piece is that if we're expecting that somebody else might agree with us about something, can't we take the lead and demonstrate a willingness, not that we have to, but a willingness to increase with a willingness to agree with what that person believes. Point 5, less is more in conflict. If we want to influence other people's thinking, don't give them 10 arguments, give them 2 or 3. Focus on the few strongest points. I think this is a really interesting and actionable thing in terms of influencing. How do we come into a disagreement with 7 points or with the 2 strongest ones? Also, reinforce freedom of choice. So as we engage with someone about their ideas, let's not suggest to them that they are not completely free to believe what they want to believe. And it's not manipulation, it's respect and it's acknowledgement. And it's also a very practical posture to take. As he says, sometimes people resist not because they're dismissing the argument. They resist because they're rejecting the feeling that their behavior is being controlled. I've had some conversations with people about vaccinations, for example, in the US, and they've said to me, it's a bad idea because the government is requiring it. So what's at the root of their ire on this is the being forced to do it, is a role of government sort of piece, not the logic of a vaccination. I think that's a very interesting point of view. It's a very interesting dynamic to be aware of in certain kinds of disagreements. So reinforce freedom of choice. Number 7, consider having a conversation about the conversation. So in the course of a disagreement, talk about how you feel about it. So for example, as he says, progress can be made by expressing disappointment or frustration about how the conversation is going. So this isn't going well. I had really hoped that this would be better, or I'm getting frustrated that we're not farther along with this. What do you think? How do you feel about it? And I see this similar to the acknowledging common ground. It's a willingness to acknowledge what's real. What's real is how I'm feeling about this. I don't have to set my emotions aside. I'm feeling aggravated. I'm disappointed. I wish we'd be a little farther along, for example. And it's being real. And it's also inviting that person's feelings, because feelings matter in a disagreement. So to the extent that I can invite a conversation about the conversation, that might also help us connect and help us be a little bit closer. And again, there's some level of common ground that we might build upon. So those would be the 7 points that I believe are most important in part 2 around interpersonal rethinking. And the third section of the book, which we'll go to now with a few of these summary points, is collective rethinking, creating communities of lifelong learners. And this is a section of the book where he talks about schools, he talks about families, he talks about businesses, politics, etc. It's quite broad in a good way, I think. But let me see if I can summarize what I believe are, in this section, I have 9 points to raise. So first, complexify contentious topics. Complexify. So don't get stuck in binary thinking. As he says, there's more than 2 sides to every story, especially things that are really polarizing and contentious. So look at polarizing issues through the many lenses of a prism. Seeing shades of gray can make us more open. Consider there's different dimensions, there's different dynamics. He talks about the example of climate change and people who are really, really zealots for protecting the climate, and people on the other end of the spectrum in complete denial. There's more than 2 things in there. And by understanding the shades of gray, there's more ways to enter into conversation and collectively rethink, complexify. Not as opposed to simplify, but as opposed to binary, there's only 2 options thinking. Number 2, expand your emotional range. Be willing to bring emotion into a disagreement, especially a disagreement with community, a workplace, a family. Emotions are real, they should be brought in, they can be brought in a very healthy way. You don't have to eliminate frustration to have a productive conversation. I see this again as a dimension of being real and bringing realness into a discussion, which I think invites other people to do the same. When I see someone I'm working with, or someone I'm close to, or someone I'm really disagreeing with, and if they demonstrate emotional range, now taking responsibility for their emotions, I'm not talking about raging at me, but if they express emotions in a responsible way, that invites me to do the same. And I can connect with them a little bit more as a human being. They're a little bit more real. So we can expand our emotional range, and that helps with creating communities of rethinkers. Number 3, abandon best practices. I love this one. It's delightfully controversial for those of us that operate in the corporate world, and many of our clients just worship best practices. We're looking to other organizations, other societies. We're looking elsewhere. How do they do it? What's the state of the art with whatever it is we're doing? And he says that's the problem. He says best practices suggest that the ideal routines are already in place. It suggests that, oh, what they're doing is going to work over here. And that may be true, but if we don't question it, then we're stuck in limiting thinking because we're basically going for an efficient, already baked solution or approach. There may be better ways to do things. Why not rethink somebody else's best practice or somebody else's solution? So abandon best practices because they fixate us on what's worked over there. That's the opportunity here for collective rethinking. Number 4, establish psychological safety. And I believe that Professor Grant was involved in Project Aristotle at Google, some of the research that was done about high-performing teams, and the conclusion that psychological safety is the one most important thing that can help promote effective teamwork. Risk-taking, voicing disagreement. We talked about task conflict earlier, voicing disagreement. On task conflict, and also accompanying that with accountability. Those two need not be mutually exclusive. And in terms of psychological safety, one of the things he recommends is not simply inviting people to disagree, telling them that they'll be fine, we won't retaliate, I won't be mad at you if you suggest something different, but affirmatively demonstrating humility is something that a leader can do to encourage psychological safety. So he talks about something that was done at the Wharton Follies, which is an end of the year event. That's always a fun thing. The second year students arranged this thing called the Follies event at Wharton. And one year the faculty got involved and they, picking up on the Jimmy Fallon TV show here in the US, there's a skit that they do called Mean Tweets, where celebrities read mean tweets about themselves. And they're basically demonstrating, it's funny, but they're demonstrating that they don't take themselves too seriously. Well, in that year, what they did in the Follies was they had faculty members reading harsh critiques of them and their teaching, and they read it. They basically said, I'm reading this, and this is, I'm the worst professor in the world, I'm the most boring something. And they're demonstrating that they can take it, that people can disagree with them and they'll be okay with it, that they don't take themselves too seriously. He cites an example where Melinda Gates brought forward some criticism of her and talked about some challenging situations that she had where she was wrong by affirmatively entering into this space of vulnerability and demonstrating vulnerability. The leaders invited other people to disagree and demonstrate their own vulnerability, thereby contributing significantly to psychological safety. It's not about telling people to disagree. It's about demonstrating to people that I'm not attached to my own views or even my own reputation or something like that. So that was I thought, a really useful series of examples about establishing psychological safety. As he says, this often starts with leaders role modeling humility. And point 5, keep a rethinking scorecard. How do we track our own rethinking? How much are we rethinking? He says, track how thoroughly different options are considered in the process. Maybe there's someone on the team or in the group who could monitor this and actually keep track of how much time we're spending talking about different ideas, what credence we give them, how we evaluate them. What's our scorecard in terms of the quality of our rethinking conversations and dynamics? He says, remember that a bad process with a good outcome is luck. A bad process with a good outcome is lucky. And a good process with a bad outcome might be a really smart experiment. Okay, point 6, throw out the personal tenure plan. So he says we shouldn't plan too much in terms of tenure. Be open to changing the plan with regard to tenure. And I think I've got a quotation here I want to go to. Yeah, he says, he says to adapt an analogy from E.L. Doctorow, writing out a plan for your life is like driving at night in the fog. You only see as far as your headlights, but you make the whole trip that way. Abandon the personal 10-year plan. He talks more about that later on, when this notion of asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. But I think this is a wonderful point. And I think that many organizations, or my clients that I've worked with who speak about this, they've abandoned the 10-year plan, for example. The long-term plan is all but abandoned because we recognize the need to rethink based upon new information that's coming our way. We get it. This is a way of summarizing that point. Just throw out the personal long-term 10-year plan. And I'd say too, the long-term strategy as well. It could be directional, but in terms of a specific strategy, it's not going to hold water because we know we need to rethink it. Number 7, seek meaning. So this is a deep, kind of a deeper notion here in terms of seeking meaning in our work, as opposed to seeking joy and short-term satisfaction in what we do. It's a form of rethinking. That's why it's here in this section. As he says, joy can wax and wane, but meaning is more likely to last. Building a sense of purpose often starts with taking actions to enhance your learning and your contribution to others. Your learning and contribution to others evokes meaning. That's more important than short-term satisfaction. Let's rethink what we do so as to be in alignment with what has meaning for us. And that's one dimension of collective rethinking. Number 8, schedule a life checkup once a year. He talks about the need to do that. We should do checkups on our cars and on our bodies. Are we doing checkups on, am I doing what I want to be doing? How is it lining up? What might I need to do differently? It's a very important reflection exercise that I talk about with my coaching clients, whether I call it a life checkup or something different. It's meaningful reflection on what matters most. I think the invitation is for us to consider what would be included in that checkup. What questions might I want to ask? Maybe who might I want to discuss my checkup results with, or calibrate or align it with? And perhaps the most important people in my life. So schedule a life checkup once a year is a recommendation that he makes. And make time to think again every week. So Professor Grant says he schedules weekly time for thinking and unlearning. And he also reaches out to his challenge network to ask what ideas and opinions they think he should be reconsidering. So ask for that input, ask for conflicting information, and make time to think again. I would actually rephrase that to take time to think again. Create time to think again, not find time, because if we wait until we find time, it could be months. That's what I found in my work, working with, well, both my own consciousness and also senior leaders. I'll find some time. No, make the time, take the time, create the time to think again, to reflect, and to have some processes that support that process for us. So that's section 3 on collective rethinking. I think it's interesting and quite broad, which is one of the things I like about the book, as I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about kids, because the collective rethinking section has a few things that really apply specifically to kids, and I think they're really important. I want to identify them. So first, have a weekly myth-busting discussion at dinner. Challenge our thinking, and as parents, demonstrate our willingness to change our own minds. Because as we all know, kids don't do what we say, they do what we do. They don't learn from what we say, they learn from what we do. We model by our actions, not our words. Are we willing to change our minds? How could we have some myth-busting discussions with our families that can demonstrate to our kids we're willing to change our minds, and we can encourage them to do the same, right? And this is a very interesting exercise activity. It's a great way to teach kids to become comfortable with rethinking. Number 2, invite kids to do multiple drafts and to seek feedback from others. Where did this idea come from that somebody should be able to be a great artist and draw something, whether you're drawing a butterfly or a bird or whatever it might be, and, oh, you create something, is it a good drawing? All right, draw it again. Get some input. Discuss with other people. do or take two, take three, take five. As we grow older and we recognize whether it's redoing recordings of sessions like this, or redoing drafts of a speech, or tweaking a PowerPoint presentation, we expect that we're going to be able to do that. We build in the time. And therefore, I don't get very upset if I make some mistakes, if I'm recording myself doing something, for example, because I know I'm going to do it again. I'm comfortable doing it again. Let's teach our kids to do that, to do multiple drafts of things as opposed to, oh, write the paper and it'll be done. No, do it again and find joy in rewriting and improving, in looking at things that aren't quite that good. And, oh, look, I can make it better. I learned something new. That joy of learning. And we can experience that with them, but invite our kids to do that. It makes them more comfortable with rethinking, with improving their own creations, and feedback from others is a way to do that as well. And the third point, he says, is stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. I love this point, and this is one of my final points here, and I think it's just so important. As he says, let's stop pressuring kids to know what they want to do professionally when they have no idea what, well, this is actually my point, not his. I want to make that clear. Let's stop pressuring kids to know what they want to do professionally when they have no idea what it means to have a job. And let's stop defining what do you want to be, like what you want to be as what job you will have. I think it's a better question. Who do you want to be, or how do you want to be in the world? Not what do you want to be? How do you want to be? What might have meaning for you, to come back to that earlier point? How might you want to be? Encourage them to discover as they go. I don't think it's reasonable to expect a small child or even a teenager to know what they want to do. I had a fascinating conversation with a colleague a few weeks ago, a colleague from India who has a child who is a senior in the equivalent of high school. And he did a tour of US colleges, and he found out that a student can change her major in the first and second and even beyond year of undergrad. They can change their course of study. He said, that's unbelievable. I didn't think that was possible. Now, in the world that I grew up in the educational system and higher education in the US, of course you can change your major. Yes, it's different if you're engineering. It's different if you're whatever, you're on that track. But even then you can change your major. You could decide, I'm not going to do engineering. I'm going to do biotech. I'm going to do whatever it might be, art history, whatever that thing might be. You can change it. It's understandable. It's allowed. We may have to overcome some family pressures in that regard, but it's allowed. It's par for the course that we'll change our mind if we're young and we try something, we realize we don't like it, and we discover something new. It's not reasonable to lock kids in my view. I mean, some of the people in Oxford and Cambridge might disagree. In my view, it's unreasonable to expect 16-year-olds to know what they want to do and lock up their academic schedule for the next 4 or 5 years. I don't think it's reasonable. They can't know. Rethinking should be encouraged, not discouraged. So stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. So 2 final quotations I'd like to share here as a way of wrapping this up that I think are really nice summaries of the value of this book. The first is a George Bernard Shaw quotation. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. So therein is our invitation. And then the second quote, which is not from this book, is something that I saw years ago, and I still think it's one of my favorites. Of course, at the time, I think I saw it in the 1980s when I was younger, from Alvin Toffler, who said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write. The illiterate of the 21st century will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that's what this book is all about. How do we do that? And the compelling case for us to do that in order to be more effective, to be happier, just be better. I encourage you to check out the book. Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. I look forward to seeing you next month, the next edition of the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. Please feel free to be in touch about this. I would welcome the conversation, even if you disagree.